Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cup, Duet Reviews, brought to you by Cup of Hemlock Theatre. I am your host for this episode, Ryan Borochovitz, co-artistic producer here at Cup of Hemlock, and I'm joined today by the always wonderful Jillian Robinson, associate producer here at the company. How are you doing today, Jill?
I'm doing well, Ryan. Thank you so much. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to talk about this piece because today we are going to be overviewing the production by Lighthouse Immersive titled The Library at Night, which is conceived and directed by Robert Lepage, inspired by the works of Alberto Manguel. And it is currently playing in Toronto until at least June 26th, might possibly get extended, hard to kind of say, because it is a kind of piece that, as long as they have the staff to run it, it theoretically could go on indefinitely. So we'll see how it goes. So I'm excited to dive into this piece. It was quite an interesting, immersive virtual reality experience. Mm-hmm. But before we get into our impressions, I have to ask, what's in your cup? And I see you have a lovely background for those who are listening just in terms of audio. Maybe you want to describe that for their benefit.
Absolutely. So behind me, I have a virtual background of several bookshelves with some multicolored looks like hardcover bound books with some cute little library lanterns and some library ladders to reach all the way to the top shelf. No book forgotten. So that's the background behind me. And I'm just wearing a little kind of like a library kind of cardigan today. Cozy vibe. And what I'm drinking is throat coat tea. At the time of this recording, I have a couple shows coming up this weekend, so I have to keep my throat in check, in good health. But I'm drinking out of my Belle mug, a character who loves books. So I thought that was quite appropriate. Mm-hmm. And I'm so excited to unpack this virtual reality journey we went on, right?
Yes.
But what's in your cup?
I know. Well, so I don't have an exciting background because my computer is old and doesn't let me do that. But I am drinking just coffee today, but it's out of my University of Toronto mug because I had to think, well, first of all, there's a little coat of arms that has little books. I don't know if anyone could see that, but right between the crown and the beaver, there's two little books. So it's, not as whimsical as yours, but it is still on theme. And I, as a graduate student at University of Toronto, spend a lot of my time in Robarts Library. So if I had to think about the library that means the most to me, currently that's the one. So U of T mug it is. Okay, yes. So let's dive right in. Kind of as per usual, when we have these sort of reviews of productions that are currently ongoing, we want to have a little bit of a non-spoiler general thoughts, kind of brief summary type discussion, and then we will put up some kind of spoiler shield where anything goes. We can talk about whatever. So if you want to go into the production not having certain things already revealed to you, we encourage you to stop watching after that point. But before we get to that, let's have the pre-spoiler talk. So I don't know if you want to start by just describing the piece before you get into your thoughts and impressions of it. Usually you toss that to me when you're hosting, but I'm happy to toss it to you here.
Yeah, I think we can teamwork it out a bit, but I'll start us off. So just from learning about the piece online, you kind of already know it's going to be a virtual reality experience, some sort of element of that. And in the little preamble online too, it does say like you will be journeying through a handful of libraries located around the world. So that's not technically a spoiler because it's on their website. But yeah, when you get there, the immersive shares a space with other immersive events and experiences that are going on too. So you kind of find where the library at night sort of stall is, and you go in, you wait for a tour guide to sort of bring you into the experience. And there's a little intro section, which, kind of to me seemed like a preface or a prologue to the journey. And you're in a room that's kind of like an older looking library space. And through lighting, you're kind of your attention is directed to certain plot points in this room. And then you get equipped with your VR headset and audio headset, and then you're brought into a sort of wooded library experience where you just sit at your library chair and get wrapped up in the virtual reality of international libraries. How do you think that went, Ryan? Do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's great. Something I'll kind of just add sort of even before the experience itself, like for those who are unfamiliar with this piece and the kind of Lighthouse Immersive as a company, these are the same people who do the Immersive Van Gogh Immersive, Frida Kahlo, Gustav Klimt, that you've probably received some targeted ads for if you're anything like us. Yeah, so I think that kind of knowing that it's the same company that does those gives a sense of what you might be into, that it is taking historical sites or works of art and kind of putting you right in the thick of them and using new technology and media to really put you in contact with these works in a way that you maybe wouldn't otherwise be. I know I have never done, I don't know if you've done any of the immersive artwork exhibits that they've done.
No, I haven't actually.
Yeah.
This was my first one.
Neither have I. I've read a lot of think pieces, you might say, on like, oh, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is this like removing the artwork from its aura, as Walter Benjamin would say, in the age of mechanical, or in this case, digital or virtual reproduction? We don't need to unpack that here because that's not really the point of this production, but I think there's a lot of interesting discourse surrounding this type of work, and having this one that isn't focused around a specific painter or artist's body of work, but instead a kind of walking tour through different libraries around the world, I think is an interesting use of this format that is maybe pushing beyond. And it kind of, I don't know if it takes a visionary auteur like Robert Lepage to kind of think through this idea, but it definitely seems like a logical step for his career, his body of work, and kind of definitely seems to fit into that sort of cohesive oeuvre, we might call it. So before we get into the spoiler zone, just what were your general impressions? We've talked about what the piece is, but what did you think without getting into too much fine detail?
Yeah, I thought it's phenomenal. I'm someone, ever since I was little, my parents have instilled like travel and culture is like as a huge sort of educational opportunity. So I have had the privilege of going to Europe and going to different places around the world. And I've always had a huge knack for just immersing myself in a like an old country or city and learning all about everything from like art to literature to just history. And so this was a very refreshing experience for me, especially coming out of the pandemic and not having been able to travel over the last couple of years. It was fascinating, like to be able to experience 10 different libraries from 10 different cities, 10 different cultures, and have sort of a different story blueprint of exploring through each of them. Because to me, every one of them was a little bit different. So it always kind of kept me on my toes. It wasn't like, you're so used to entering a museum or entering an art gallery and you get the little audio guided tour and you're going to walk through and see the picture and have it described to you, and then you move on to the next hall. And this was, every library was kind of its story was told in a different way. And I thought that was really fascinating. That to me definitely added and infused the theatrical element. Whereas, I was kind of interested and intrigued to think, is this just going to be a sort of tourist attraction to each of these libraries, which also would have been amazing and super stimulating for me. But it was when you get into each library, the way that each library is presented, there's some of them involve certain artistic flares, and there's like a reasoning behind that. So after our spoiler image will be put on the screen, we can dive more into that. But yeah, I liked that. I was always in anticipation of what was going to happen. It wasn't like after the third library, okay, I kind of understand what this is. This is very much like I'm just traveling through old libraries around the world, which is super stellar and awesome for me regardless. But it was like, oh, this is where there's the theatrical element too, because like I said, each library's story was given an artistic flair that the one before it didn't have, in my opinion. So, or didn't, showed a different way. So, and I again thought it was just going to be a virtual reality experience. So I kind of liked the intro flourish and sort of the whole ambiance around you setting the stage for you as the audience before you put the virtual reality goggles on. So again, we can maybe unpack specifics post spoiler image as well, but it definitely exceeded my expectations across the board.
Yeah.
But how about you, Ryan?
I would agree. So you prefaced your kind of appraisal with your travel enthusiasm there. So something I'll say about myself, which I don't feel like I've ever really gotten into on here, but like I am someone who doesn't really have the travel bug. And I know, that's shocking to people like yourself who really, like, I've never really traveled. It wasn't a part of how I was raised or upbringing. And I've never really kind of found the appeal, and perhaps you and your infinite wisdom are working on shaking me out of that, and we'll see how that goes. But what I do love are books and libraries, and I've always felt like, well, why do I need to travel to such and such place when I could just read about it? And I know to the magic of live theater, we could kind of unpack, what's the difference between these two things. But yeah, like as someone who's never really felt the compulsion to travel, I will say getting to sit in a chair in Toronto, the city I live in, and have the ability to, through the wonderful technology that is available to us, feel like I've traveled without actually having to leave the city I live in, and get to see exactly the types of sites that I might be most excited to visit in these other cities, and not just cities, but also periods of history, as we will discuss probably post spoiler. I thought this was like a very intriguing, like exciting way, and it took someone like me who isn't necessarily enthused by this wanderlust of gotta see these sites, to be like, aha, but what if these sites were all libraries and there's all these cool books and talks about the history of books? And I'm like, okay, you got me there. Color me intrigued. So yes, that is my kind of general thoughts appraisal. I thought it was really fun. Fun is the word I would use, because, when you talk about like a museum walking tour, listening to the headset, I feel like a lot of people might, to each their own, think that might sound a little dry or boring or dull. But I think, it was, it wasn't flashy, or I was expecting it to be very flashy, but it was kind of just like, this is what it is. This is, we have the technology, but we're just using it to show you these kinds of things. Or not, like, it wasn't necessarily as much of a spectacle as I was expecting it to be. And I think that's for the better, that this is just like see the show. It also wasn't terribly expensive for something that kind of involves technology, which, I think our tickets were like $40 roughly. So, so I think, it's worth what you're paying for, and it's not a huge deal, but it's very fun. It's an exciting journey. There's elements of interactivity and choose your own adventure that we'll talk about in a minute. But overall, I would encourage people to see it. I think it's a good time, and you'll probably find something you enjoy in it, regardless of whether you're more like Jill or more like myself.
Exactly. Yeah. Great. Cool. Is this the time, I think
I think this might be the time to. So once again, this is playing at the Lighthouse Immersive space here in Toronto until at least June 26th, TBD about after that. So if you're able to see it, we encourage you to do so. You'll probably have fun. That's the key word. Nice. And click, I think we just turned on our little spoiler book lamp that's showing up on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. Okay, so there's a lot we could talk about. I there's a couple of topics. Since I'm hosting, I guess I'll sort of lead the ship here.
Take the reins,
lead our Captain Nemo submarine, if you will.
Yes.
But there's a few things that I'd like to kind of use as entranceways, and the first one is that I want to talk about Alberto Manguel and this work as adaptation, because, I've said on the show many times that I'm a bit of an adaptation specialist when it comes to my own academic research in theater and performance. And I think I want to talk about what even is this piece in terms of its relationship to the source material. Because Alberto Manguel, very interesting writer, a historian, he's written fiction, nonfiction, and a very kind of focused interest in the history of books and literature. And something that I think is interesting is the title of this piece that we saw is The Library at Night, which is a book of his that I have right here for those looking on the screen. I took this out from the U of T library. Hey, that's like what I mentioned earlier, when this piece was announced. And I've actually just it's funny. I've kind of come in and out of it. I haven't been reading it like sequentially, or certainly not the only or main thing I'm reading right now. Just I've had it out for like over a month now, and every few days I'll just read a chapter. And it's interesting because watching the production, you might expect that this book would be 10 chapters. Each chapter is one of the libraries, but it's actually not that. It's divided into more than 10 chapters. I could be wrong looking at the table of context, but it's organized thematically. That it's the library as myth, library as order, a library as space, library as power, as shadow, etc., etc. I don't need to go through all of them. Yeah. But it's essentially meditations on just the concepts of books and libraries and the sort of mystical relationship that a book lover has to libraries, what they've meant throughout history, what they've meant, different ideas they've engendered. And that's what each of those thematic subheadings are. And it goes through the history and key libraries very much. I'm pretty sure for the most part, everything we heard auditorily, which is also narrated by Manguel himself. So he basically gave a sort of fragmented audiobook version of some of the highlights from this book is what we're presented with here. But it's very much, there's a line in it that every library is an autobiography of its owner, because I could be paraphrasing this, but that we have and I think this also goes back to a line in Lepage's earlier piece, 887, where he says something very similar about how it's sort of a schematic of its owner's brain, and the organizing principles that you use to put some books in one place really tells you a lot about the person who owns it. And I see this text that this is adapted from as not necessarily a history of libraries or even a sightseeing tour of libraries, but it is just a testament to this one individual's lifelong love affair with the concept of libraries and reading and engagement. And I kind of think it's, on one hand, we'll get into this maybe more in the middle, that it's kind of, I don't know if this piece necessarily does justice to the exuberance that you get reading that book, because it sort of pigeonholes it into these 10 libraries, which isn't the structuring principle of the book itself. Oh, also, something else I'll add is that Manguel has another book that came out after this one called Packing My Library or Unpacking My Library, which I have not read yet, so I won't comment on that one in particular. But I think it's interesting that this piece, despite being called The Library at Night, isn't labeled as adapted from the book of the same name by Manguel. It's inspired by Manguel. So maybe it took passages from that too. Again, not in the position to do the comparative exercise of unpacking that library in particular. But I would like to read that one after I finish this one, because I think, he's just a brilliant writer, and I'm loving immersing myself in his experience of this. But sorry, I've been talking a lot. Do you want to add anything?
No, that's okay. No, I just I feel like I was already going to want to do this, but now that you've unpacked a little bit of Alberto Manguel's writings, I definitely want to read The Library at Night for sure. And then, I would love to read Unpack My Library too. That's another thing I appreciated about this experience is I did not know about this book or that something like this existed, but again, through a theatrical threading of or adaptation of this book, it just added the whole layers that now I'm kind of recalling back to our last Duet review, Ryan, of Unpacking Lessons and Forgetting. We kind of just unearthed that art has layers, and with this piece, I felt it was like books have layers, or libraries have layers, and throughout the whole journey, and by like you say, by this pigeonholing into each library, kind of there's Alberto's words, but being used in a tactile setting. And I was like, oh my gosh, not only are there, it's the idea of the library, but there are different types of libraries and different types of libraries through the, across history. It's not just all modern libraries we're unpacking. Right. And so, I think I would love to read the book, because I don't think it would do what we saw. But I would like to have that comparative sort of essay going on, I guess, in my mind.
Yeah, well, that's definitely what I had going in, because I think what this piece does very interestingly, and of course, adaptations and the sources that inspire them are their own independent works of art, that there obviously is a causal relationship between them, but they do have the right to stand on their own. That's literally the founding gesture of adaptation studies as a discipline. What this piece does very well is it takes this kind of messy thematic web that the book presents, which kind of is sort of what the title, The Library at Night, is. He says this in the very first chapter, is that like in the daytime, the library has structure and order, but at night it kind of, everything blends together. So, and I kind of think by spatializing it in terms of taking this web of themes and just compacting it into the specific libraries that inspired them and creating this 10-chapter structure around like tangible physical locations as opposed to just whatever thoughts and themes the author had in his mind when he sat down to write any one individual chapter. It's kind of like it's doing what you said earlier of kind of turning it into a walking tour or a sitting tour, in this case, spinning around in your chair tour. But it's giving you the opportunity to travel through it in a way that it forces it into a structure. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I like, short of just listening to an audiobook of this piece, I don't really know how you could necessarily do that justice without go ahead. You want to?
Well, this may just like blast us into a whole nother thing, but to me, it personified the books, personified the text, not just personified the libraries. I'm talking about individual texts, and we can get into more and more, but like I said earlier in my intro, is each library to me had a different artistic flair or offering. And whether that be with the story, like the spoken text that was attributed to the library, or the visuals that was attributed to the library, like sometimes both were working at the same time. But now that I'm meditating on what we're talking about, to me, it's like it gave, by throwing this novel into a theatrical adaptation, the books are personified. There's some libraries where the books you see burning. There's some libraries where you find out the books can only be touched by certain people. There's some libraries where you find that the books have been neglected. They are now called the forgotten books. There's some where the books or scrolls or texts are spun around in a ritualistic environment. So or books are surrounded by people who are spinning around and dancing. So it's like, to me, each, like not only was it magnifying these libraries from like a touristy and like interesting historical perspective, but the texts that are found within the libraries, Nemo's library, those books are not in color. We don't get to see their color. We only see the black and white of the, so to me, it like created, it made me feel like bad for the books, or like have pathos for the books. It made me want to read more books. It made me want to cherish like the information we retain from books. And so, that's just like a little...
I absolutely love what you've just said here, because yes, the books themselves, even more so than the libraries, are the protagonist of this piece, even more so than Manguel as our kind of like bird's eye autobiographical narrator here. He is telling the story of these books and the places where we might find them. And this, like in adaptation studies, there's a lot of discussion about how, like, what is an adaptation's relationship to the books, not just in the story that it takes from them, but actually the books themselves. Thomas Leach, a very important adaptation theorist, he has an essay from 2008 called Adaptation, the Genre, where he sort of isolated like what are some general traits that adaptations all have with each other. And a common one that he noticed in many adaptations, especially specifically film in this case, is that adaptations tend to emphasize books and words and authors. In like that, we often see, like, I don't know, you could take the recent Little Women, the Greta Gerwig's Little Women film, about how it's not just the story of the Little Women, but it's also a meta commentary on female authorship and actually producing the book that, metatextually is itself Little Women. It starts with this idea of the book that we see on screen in so many adaptations, as Leach says, begin with, here's a book, and we open it up, and kind of like early Disney movie, we go into the book because that is the vehicle through which the story's told, even though it's not, because what we're watching is a movie, not reading a book. And I kind of have, there's a quote I sort of wanted to bring up here from this book, Adaptation in Contemporary Theater by Frances Babbage, to kind of bring it to more of a theatrical angle, because Leach's essay is mostly about a film. That she also kind of emphasized this idea of performing books as something that comes up a lot in contemporary theatrical adaptations. And if I could read this passage here, these performances, quote, testify to the potency not simply of narratives, but books themselves, as talismanic yet vulnerable objects, and celebrate the capacity of readers to make a text meaningfully their own, end quote. So yeah, I think what better piece to be the subject of an adaptation than a piece that is all about celebrating books and kind of giving books their due, even when, in this case, we're not encountering them through the vehicle of books. And that's also an interesting idea of, and there's a lot of talk, again, in adaptation theory about how we maybe privilege the source medium over the media that we are encountering it in. So even though we're not sitting down and reading a book when we go to a performance like Library at Night, are we still kind of creating this hierarchy of books good, theatrical performance, or multimedia performance in this case bad, or do they kind of enter this sort of dialogue with each other on more of a level playing field?
Right.
I don't know if you have thoughts on any of that, or we can.
No, I think so, absolutely. And I think just like an added thing too, to kind of go back to you absolutely nailing it on the head of like our books are our protagonists, and I was kind of unpacking that too, and seeing it from, because you're right, like it's all about books. We're literally immersed in the environment that the books are why you go to a library, and to retain information, which is inside books usually. But what I also like going into each one, I was interested, because with virtual reality experiences, I'm like, okay, what is just happenstance and what is maybe staged? Because knowing like for VR or, what are those called? Go, those types of cameras where you can
GoPro.
like GoPro, exactly. So it's like, you can put that anywhere. And then the information you get from that GoPro is just whatever walks by or whatever sounds happen around that GoPro. So for this, it was like, was the view of said library just kind of like placed, and like we were actually just seeing living, breathing bodies in the space. And then afterwards, Lepage et al. Had to like get consent from the people that were in the library when their GoPro was on, or were these staged actors? Now, there's some elements that absolutely is acted. Like I would say, like in Nemo's library, those are two actors. The ghost apparitions we get in Copenhagen, those are obviously actors. But the folks underneath, you're standing in Copenhagen, you're standing on a balcony looking down. The folks underneath are those just people using the library space for study. A couple of the libraries, and we can maybe unpack this down the line too, because I know, Ryan, it was on your mind. Some of the libraries have janitors. And we know that we're witnessing the library at night. So like that's usually when libraries and public spaces are sanitized. So like it was that staged. Is there a reason for that? So, and then for example, going into was it the Admont Library and the one in Austria?
Yeah.
Yeah. So having like the monks float in, and you know the fact that they're the only ones that can touch the book. And I'm like, okay, well, this is probably staged. I don't know. There was this weaving of like, what is reality? What is real time happening? And what is staged? And then kind of going into the stage thing. The Sarajevo one was absolutely staged because you had like a cellist walk into the scene. So that was just kind of an interesting play on virtual reality. Because again, talking about layers, it was like, what is reality, I guess, because like especially going into the Library of Mexico City, like there was seemed like everyday folks walking up and down the corridor, and we were just kind of standing there witnessing. But then there's dancers on the outside of the library windows doing a dance, and you hear
a regular occurrence.
But it was like, it's very performative. So like, were they selected specially that day to put on more of a performance? So I guess I was constantly being thrown into like, what is fabricated, what is acting, what is the performance, and what is real? And similar to what you said of these two mediums of like virtual reality, digitized life, and this like books, text as text, sort of like liveness versus mediatization, right? A tactile book versus like an audio book. I was constantly asking the question, what is acting and what is just real life that we're watching? So
I love all that. Yeah, I think that's great. We've circled around this a lot, so maybe that's the time to kind of just get into our actual experiences of this walkthrough journey. Before we get to the VR itself, you mentioned in your preamble about the production that there is this first room that you go into that is kind of a self-enclosed, a bit of a prologue or a preface. I like that terminology you used. Yeah. What were your thoughts just on this room before we get to the actual more interactive 10 library VR segment?
Yeah, so funnily enough, the room's ambiance is kind of like what my background, what it looks like and what I've described earlier. And it was very much, we were kind of brought into just like this rectangular room, and every wall was flanked with books. Some of the walls had scrim over top of the books, because basically there was like a main table in the middle of the room, and some benches along the side as well. And some like windows with like fake foliage and raindrops coming down. So, and it was dark outside these windows. So it's like you're literally entering a library at night, and you have the guide there saying like, feel free to look around. So instantly, I with immersive experiences, similarly in the Grim Night review we did, I'm like, I am always like frontline, like exploring instantly. So, you walk around and you see like an Alice in Wonderland, you see like Tolkien, you see these like, you see there was like a textbook from Columbia University. So there's just like an eclectic blender, use that term a lot in our Duet reviews, eclectic blender of text, and ones that you're familiar with, one that are historically relevant, one that you're like, I haven't read that, but I should read that, or it's on my list. And then of course there's like little artifacts around, like you would find in like a library. There's a study desk with like a book open. So you're there's portraits. So you're kind of like immersed in this like old timey study library. And then the guide says like, the initial experience is about to begin. The initial presentation is about to begin, and lights will kind of go off and on. So like safety first, feel free to wander, but at your own sort of pace. And then there was like, a little intro presentation, and lights would or spotlights would sort of illuminate certain objects or certain areas of the room that would obviously, if darkness is surrounding you, you're enticed to follow the light. So you would go to, and they were talking about the Library of Sarajevo. You would go to the wall that was illuminated, and then that was the wall that had like the scrim behind it, and the books that you saw that were books are now battered and burnt books, because you notice once you go into the immersive experience that the Library of Sarajevo went up in flames during the war. They unpack the whole Alexandria library experience with like the picture that they have there too. I'm like probably not doing this justice, but
no, you're doing great.
I realize now that I'm saying this, that this prologue preface was giving us little bite-sized pieces of the actual libraries we were about to embark on. And and then once that's done, like I said, you kind of step out of the experience for a hot second to learn the ropes of your VR goggles. And then the guide, like every fun Disney movie where there's like a big castle and there's secret library walls, pushes a wall and you enter this like birchwood forest, that the floor of the forest are actually pages, like the textiles are pages of books. And then you look up and you're like, oh, it must be like tree leaves. And no, it's actually like green or teal bound books hanging from like the ceiling. Books, like birds made of books. And then there's several rows of old-timey library oak cedar tables with matching spinny chairs, and the little stereotypical like green desk lamps, and then you sit and put on your goggles and you get in there. And then once we can, I guess I'll before we go into the goggles, Ryan, I'll toss back to you if you want to add anything about what.
Yeah, like a couple, like you summed it up very well. I have like a couple thoughts about this prologue room, because while I think it was necessary to have something that kind of brought us into the world and kind of very much did kind of have this prologue feel and sort of established a lot of themes and things that we're going to see as we go. I kind of, there were a few things that I was a little iffy on in this room as just, well, one, it felt very much like an escape room. I don't know if you've ever done an escape room.
Yeah.
Because it was just like such a confined space and we were in there with like two other couples, that we were kind of like, okay, we're trapped in here, what's happening? And we can explore and maybe we'll find something. And especially finding out there was a wall that spun around to lead to a secret passage. It almost kind of felt like, oh, are we looking for something specific? Is this a game almost? And I was also afraid to touch anything because I wasn't sure if we were allowed. I don't know. Because like, I don't know, I go to a library, I see all these books. The first thing I want to do is like pull things off, read it. Like, but I'm like, oh wait, I probably shouldn't. These are props. This is a set. So, and a lot of this I think came down to the manicured feel the whole thing had. It didn't really feel like it was inviting of that kind of full exploration. And probably because it just was like a small space where pretty much everything to look at was just on the perimeter of it, with the exception of like one table in the middle. Kind of it had more of like a art gallery feel than an actual like immersive space where you can explore. Like you can look at everything on the walls, but yeah, I don't know. Like I was waiting to see like, okay, what's going to happen here, and then we kind of just had this lovely little monologue, and then moved on to the other room. The other thing I'll say, in terms of the directing our focus and attention with the lights, I think was interesting because it kind of created a sense of structure for this room. But again, that maybe kind of inhibited our capacity to explore it. And because you think of an immersive piece as I get to choose my own adventure, like at one point it's funny, like you were looking at one thing on the table and you hadn't yet noticed that the lights changed to direct attention to this painting of the Tower of Babel on the wall during a part where, and I kind of poked you on the back and pointed, be like, look, we're supposed to look here now. And after I did that, I'm like, I probably should have just let you explore and do your thing. But I'm like, you might be missing something important. I didn't know what was like so yeah, like I think it was, to me, the setup of that room wasn't as inviting to free exploration as I might have liked. But then you get to the VR and that's kind of entirely self-directed, or at least more so self-directed. But yeah, like I liked it. I think it was necessary to have a kind of prologue. In fact, one mild critique I have about the entire experience that I might as well just say now is that I would have liked to have something like that prologue also at the very end to put a cap on it. Because after you completed the 10 rooms, you just kind of took off your headset and okay, you can go. And like it might have been nice to have something that was like a definitive end, especially since if you happen to get through your rooms faster than other people doing the experience at the same time, you weren't sure, like, do I sit and wait? Do I leave? Like, so I think these kinds of bookend framing devices are helpful. I just feel like they could have maybe been more organically weaved into the essence of this type of interactive experience. Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with that too. There was some moments of just like, I'll go with the flow of like, what's next? I guess we're getting our VR headsets out. I guess which I didn't mind too much, but it's a very light critique here. But,
right.
But let's put on our headsets and talk about so I kind of, obviously, so there were 10 rooms. I'll just, in no particular order, I'll say that the 10 libraries around the world were in Ottawa, Washington, D.C., the Library of Alexandria from ancient Egypt, Sarajevo, one of them was in Japan, Copenhagen, Paris, Mexico City, Vienna, and a fictional library in Captain Nemo's submarine from 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Yeah. So those were the 10 rooms. And when you put on the headset, the kind of virtual sandbox environment that you're in is like a birch forest with these 10 different icons that create a 360 like sort of Game of Thrones sigils all around you. Yeah. And you kind of look at any one of them, and then your cursor goes over it, and then it redirects you to that room. Yeah. And so that's kind of the interface where you decide the order that you go into them. So we don't have to necessarily talk about all 10 of them because we might be here for a while, but I'm curious for you to just walk me through your journey. What was the first one you saw? What was the last one? Were there any meaningful connections from one to the immediate next one you did? Just what were highlights of your particular journey?
Yeah. Just to kind of talk to you about what the ambiance is in this like selection process. I absolutely thought Game of Thrones sigils, and also anyone who's done talking about literature on Pottermore to pick your Patronus. it's that exact environment. You're in like this birchwood forest. There's like
so clearly they just found stock footage of forest at night.
But yeah, so I got in, and the planner in me was like, I know they do this show or offer this show every half hour. And I know there's 10 libraries I need to see. And I remember our guide was saying, if you want to get out of a library, you can press a little button on your headset, but know that like, if you don't, it'll naturally end on its own and you're brought back to the main page. So I got into the goggles and I kind of had to like, look around this selection space first. I'm like, okay, there's some stars at night. There's like woods below me. And then, okay, this is the sigils around us or whatever. And I started being like, okay, I can't waste time in here. I got to see these libraries because I don't know. The last thing I want is to leave this experience not having seen a library, right? So the tourist in me was like, the Disney World goer was like, okay, what's your itinerary? You're going to hit all of these rides. You're going to hit all of these shows. So I was like, I got to hit all the libraries. So I could have just instantly chose the first one in front of me, which I think would have been Ottawa. But I kind of looked to the left and I just got started. So I started with Sarajevo, and then I went clockwise, I think, or counterclockwise in order of sigils. Right. So I didn't like explore to find which one I wanted to do. I was like, okay, Jill, you need to make sure you see all of these libraries. Just go in order. It wasn't until like the third library I realized once you've gone into a crest, it popped the name of the city underneath it. So it knows and that you hit that library already. And if you wanted to return or something, you could. But I was like, we're good. Return is a last resort.
See, funny thing about that before you continue your journey. Yeah. Like I had the same idea of I want to make sure I hit all of them, so I'll do them in order. But then I noticed immediately after doing the first one, which for me was Ottawa, which funny is a city I lived in for 3 years, but I never went to the parliamentary library, so that's cool. But yeah, so after I did the first one, and then I noticed it said Ottawa underneath the sigil when I returned, and none of the others said the name. I realized, okay, that's how I can keep track. And then I very quickly decided I'm not going to do them in any particular order. I'm going to just choose my own adventure based on which sigil I think looks cool. And I'll use the names on the bottom to kind of just make sure that I do get to see all of them before the end, assuming time would permit. So, sorry. Wow. Okay, so you started in Sarajevo, you said?
Yeah, and so that one was stunning. Basically, you're like placed in the center of this like circular hall, and there's like a large white staircase on sort of one of the sides of the circle or hexagon or what have you. And then there's bookcases on flanking the other two sides, and then like doors to the outside world mirroring this white staircase. And and then Alberto monologues as he does for all of them basically, and it's a mixture of, in my opinion, each library was like this for me. It was like a mixture of history and storytelling, or at least some sort of melange of that. And then depending on where you move your head or what you where you're looking or what you want to follow in the space, sort of is your own adventure to this prescribed audio you're hearing. And so with Sarajevo, this one was probably the most stunning artistically for me, because he was talking and, mainly the thesis of, in my opinion, of this library was him unpacking of when the library went up in flames during the Bosnian War, correct?
Well, yeah, the kind of Yugoslavian war, and all of them got balkanized in the 90s, yeah.
Exactly. So, so he's recounting, kind of introing into the library, and then all of a sudden, like a cellist descends the stairs and starts playing a cello. And then slowly again, he's unpacking this historical moment of going up in flames, and you literally see one by one each shelf of books sort of go up in flames. And then the cellist is still playing. And then you start also hearing war noises in the background and like tanks. And if you look to the door, there were tanks actually like driving behind the outside doors. And then you got the little morsel of information of the individual who was playing the cello during when the library was going up in flames, correct? Like,
yeah.
Again, here's the thing with me and immersive pieces. I'm not going there to know exactly what is chronologically being spit at me. I kind of just like to just allow information to hit me. So apologies in advance if I'm like, and this is exactly what was said in this library, because I don't really know.
Our job is not to give a history lesson. What I will say though, like, because at Sarajevo, I encountered this library like about midway through my journey, but I will say this was my favorite room of the entire piece. And what I liked about it so much was that it really made great use of this 360-degree sort of angle. I found with a lot of the rooms, well, necessarily like name specific ones, but I found that it very much was either the interesting thing is happening on this side, or so you just you can always like turn around, but there's nothing going on there. Just keep looking at this one. It's really like the light in that first prologue room, kind of really directing your attention to something specific.
Yeah.
And then there were others where it's kind of like nothing of major consequences happening anywhere. You can turn around and explore all you want, but it's more just about the environment than anything that it wants you to see. What I loved about Sarajevo was that there were two main things of consequence happening that you could choose to look at, one or the other. There was the tanks outside the window, and there was the cellist on the staircase. And which one you choose to look at more, obviously you want to get the whole experience and look at both and like kind of pan around the whole room, especially when the flames start. But choosing to look at the cellist is an active decision to not look at the tanks. And that I mean, spiritually is what that cello, this musician who decided to like quite literally fiddle all Rome burn in a way. But yeah, it's Manguel said in his narration that this is like the first, what we might call the first historical instance of memory side. By burning the library, it's a deliberate attempt to not just wipe a culture out, but destroy memory of a culture. Libraries being this place where memory is preserved, or books are preserved, and culture is preserved through memorial. Like, again, the physicalization of memory in the form of books and the palaces we erect to hold them. So what I kind of love is you could just stare out the window and see, oh my God, there's tanks, shit's going down. And you could listen to the music and have this lovely soundtrack to it. But I chose to spend most of my time in that room just, glancing at the tanks, glancing at the fire, but just really focusing on the cellist and be like, this is the beauty of art that like this building was meant to represent, that this artist's decision to play in this moment was very much. And I felt like I had the most agency in that room to decide what kind of experience, not just of the VR, digital sandbox, but also of this moment in history. Like, so I absolutely love that one. Like, I liked a lot of them. I liked all of them, and to varying degrees, but I think that one was my favorite experience of the entire piece.
So I actually focused mostly on the books, the burning books in that one. I didn't want to hear the cellist. I didn't want to see the tanks. I was like, that was where we talked about the books were protagonists for me.
Right.
And it was just the visualization. It wasn't like some like 1980s or 90s video game where like flame happens and like, bam, everything's in flame. No, it slowly crept into each window bearing a bookcase.
Yeah.
And I couldn't look away. And I felt like so bad. My heart was aching. I was like, I get there's tanks outside. I get there's a cellist playing, but like what's actually happening right now is really shitty. Like it's heartbreaking. So that was my first room too. So I instantly was like, ooh, each one of these libraries are gonna do something to a book or do something to like, make me feel remorse or feel enlightened, or I was like, oh, this is, and then it wasn't like a disappointment at all, but it was very interesting to see as I kind of went library by library, was totally not that. Like, and every room I entered, it wasn't like I was like, okay, what book am I gonna like be attracted to the most? And like, right, like what character am I gonna relate to the most in this one? No, it was like, oh no, this experience is different. This experience is more historical or more cultural, and I'm just standing there absorbing the information. Or this experience is more visual, right? With like Alexandria, like you're up in the stars, and then you're like you're in the scrolled sort of case that goes up in flames as well. And I liked that each room wasn't as character immersive or artistically immersive as the other, because it allowed just more layers and more nuance to the piece as a whole, I guess, to this collection of libraries, this library of libraries, I guess, as a whole. And so specifically kind of going, I don't remember what, I could not tell you, like library 2 was this, library 3 was this, library 4 was that. I don't remember. I know, like I said, I went in order. So whoever's watching this and has done it as well, if you remembered the order, good for you. But I, again, was just like, I'm just going to go to the next room and let stuff hit me. And I had very interesting like afterthoughts from each of them. Like, one of my favorite libraries from an aesthetic point of view was the one in Austria. I loved like the how it was so light. Like there was windows, like there's like a pastel sort of like Baroque, I guess would be the period, or like.
Where it's almost kind of, I don't remember if that one was
Baroque. It gave me like Marie Antoinette vibes, like the same aesthetic of Kirsten Dunst's Marie Antoinette, like the pastels, like kind of, I felt like I was like in a candy shop that was like a library, like it was, and that was refreshing too, because this thing was called Library at Night, and I love like light spaces. I'm all like, give me all the lights. And so like that was, it was like a daytime experience. And then having just like the meditative vibes of monks kind of walking in and out and being the only ones able to touch the books and leaving. And you hear the birds outside. Like this was a very like breath of fresh air kind of thing. And then you feel like you're on like the set of Guardians of the Galaxy 3 when you're like placed into the Alexandria library where you're literally happening in space. And then, but you get, from there, you move from being up in the sky to, like I said, being literally behind some of the OG scrolls that then get caught on fire, and you're now trapped in this box and you're like, oh my God, I'm burning with these books. And then they flip you to what that library looks like today. And again, you're back in space and you have an aerial view. Mm-hmm. So some libraries were like that, where it kind of was episodic, almost like you're riding Star Tours in Disney World. But then you have something like a Mexico City where you're just standing in the main corridor, looking above, looking around you and taking in information.
The big skeleton ahead of you. There's dancers to this side. That was one that like I thought was very visually nice, and it's a beautiful space, but it's kind of the example in my mind that I go to when I talked about Sarajevo, by contrast, other ones where you're just like, okay, is something going to happen? What do I look at? The dancing was happening from beginning to end with like no change. There were people walking through, like, again, lovely environment, but I was kind of waiting to be like, I think that one is also the second one I encountered, because the first one was Ottawa. And that one has like a very clear bird show that the nice lady shows up to open up the Birds of America books, and she flips to each page, and then suddenly that bird shows up and she like gives you something very three-dimensional to look at. Like, so then going to Mexico City right after, I was expecting halfway through the room there would be something like the bird show, and then there wasn't, which was like fine, but it made some rooms in my mind more dynamic than others. And I don't think that's a problem. It just kind of really, I found the really memorable ones were the ones that kind of had some kind of either narrative element, like Alexandria, where it takes you from, the cosmos to ancient Egypt to contemporary Egypt, or ones like Sarajevo, where it's just like, I am going to experience this art in the abyss of destruction.
Yeah. One thing that's popping into my brain too, and again, maybe this is pivoting a bit on the journey we're going. I'm going into another stack of the library. To me, I felt there were every library, like I said, every experience was so different, yet so rich in its own way.
Mm-hmm.
But I felt, if I were to collectively look at this piece from a bird's eye view, stepping outside of the library, outside of the piece, there was a theme of, and not at the same time, but the theme of either death, neglect, or isolation, or intimidation for me.
Sure.
And the reason why I kind of anchoring in those four is because I think each library either has one of those themes present or is trying to unpack one of those themes, or maybe has tidbits of every one of those themes. And what's really interesting and how this piece is on now, and potentially, as Ryan said, running until June 26th, maybe even beyond. But, and this was also sprinkled in their advertising too, of coming outside of the pandemic, or being still very much in the pandemic, but sort of breaking out, blossoming out of the isolation perspective of the pandemic. And, you know, that alone, like, to me, I kind of meditating on this piece, and as we're talking it out, it's like very interesting to me of like a library, which technically is like a little micro world. Mm-hmm. It's packed with so many things, so many different genres, so many different types of books from different time periods. There is no way that you can step into the libraries that are a part of this experience. So the grandiosity, is that a word, of each library, there's no way you can go in and fully explore. Similarly, like, there's no way you can do that in the world, or you can try really hard, but like, there's probably going to be little nicks in your plan. And so I think there's an intimidation also just of individual going back. What does it mean to go back into the world? What does it mean to take the vulnerable step into a library, which can be very intimidating? You don't know where to start. There's actually a moment in this piece where they're talking about like, how do you know like where to start, or like what to read, you know, and then sprinkled in a couple things that are coming to mind of like in Copenhagen, you see all the ghost apparitions on the outside of the library. What you find out about this library is that a lot of these books aren't even documented anymore. They're known as the forgotten books. And yet you look down and there's a bunch of individuals using this library now solely as a space of study, and they all have their laptops open. And it's like they're getting virtual library access now, as opposed to like cracking a spine on actual books. So there's a loss there. And we talked about Sarajevo, like things going up in flames. There's a loss there. Even the library in Japan, it's a lovely space, but it's engrossed in like a forested area that's isolated, and that's fine, that's lovely. But again, I felt myself being like, there's only ever people exploring if they decide to explore to that remote section of that specific forested area. Otherwise, these books are alone. And so I feel like this piece definitely resonates now. I mean, I think it always will, because again, another paraphrasing from the piece of like, books will outlast all of us essentially, because they're just, once they're created, unless they're burned or actively destroyed. So I that was kind of just like a spiral, but.
Oh, it's okay. Like, I guess to kind of just pick up on this, like, just to talk about a few other rooms that I thought were interesting. Like, I don't think we have time to really unpack all of them, but I want to talk about janitors, since you brought it up. There were two libraries in particular that featured janitors prominently. One of them was Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress, and the other was the Copenhagen Library that you were just talking about with the ghosts. And I actually, just in the happenstance of my journey, I encountered these back to back, kind of roughly in the middle of the journey. So I had my little Janitor Interlude in the middle of my trip. And again, you talked about like what's real, what's not, who are actors, what's staged. You know, it's possible to think that, the janitors are just like, yep, we are filming this at night when the main population isn't there, so of course the janitor is just doing their business. But I feel like, to me, this piece is a little too manicured and too precise to, I don't think it's an accident that there are janitors in these shots. They could have told the janitor, listen, we're filming here. Can you come back in an hour? But I think it's very deliberate that in these two rooms in particular, we get to see a janitor. And especially because DC is the one I saw right before Copenhagen, we start on the top of the dome and we're slowly descending down to the ground floor of the library. And we start with this artwork that's on the ceiling, and then we go to these crests of different cultures and what they represent in the eyes of the American Republic, from the history of Egypt and the invention of writing to the cultivation of science to perfection in the USA. This sort of narrative journey through these murals, and then we get to the sculptures of the great men in history, and how Manguel said in his narration that each of these statues are not only, paraphrasing again, but not only a testament to the greatness of these figures, but they are a monument to the less canonical figures who don't get represented. And it was right when I heard that I noticed the janitor standing parallel among these sculptures of the great men of history. So right off the bat, we're like, okay, we're talking about the, for everything that's featured as, we're forgetting the millions and millions and billions of people who, don't get to be heralded as great men of history. In fact, anyone who's not a man isn't treated as a great man of history. But then we get this janitor who, on one hand, is standing in for those forgotten masses, but at the same time is, in this moment, standing among those great men in history.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's just something really beautiful about that. And then the next room I did immediately after that was Copenhagen, where, we're living among the ghosts, but who's standing on the same plane as the ghosts? It's this janitor lady who is just cleaning the doors. She is standing on the level that the actual main public, the living public, is not able to access. Sorry, you want to chime in?
Well, I think I'm going to mention the big P word again. We are now living in a historical moment. We are living in a pandemic. Yeah. And I think to me, now that you're saying this out, the role of the sanitizing engineers in these libraries you're talking about are now becoming sort of historically stamped in. Quite literally, it's funny. Yeah, I didn't focus as much on what you were talking about in the Washington, D.C. one, but absolutely that janitor cleaning that space is a frontline worker. And frontline workers over the last couple of years have been our heroes. And I think there's also something neat to this sort of a bit of take you out of it, sanitizing, and I don't mean sanitizing in a negative connotation, because I think that can come across. But what does it mean? How precious it is that preservation of text and preservation of space is needed, And I think it sort of gives a bit of a protagonist role to those janitors that I now unpacking it. I don't think it is happenstance. I think it definitely adds a sprinkle of reality. We, more than ever, we're seeing janitors, sanitation folks all over wherever you go, because we're living in the middle of a global respiratory pandemic where spaces and surfaces need to be sanitized. So there's a literal sort of reality in that. But I think knowing that, like you're saying in Copenhagen, that same janitor stands amongst these forgotten books or these forgotten apparitions. There's kind of the forgotten heroes of our present day, which a lot of the time are frontline healthcare workers, janitors, etc. And then a different perspective, but it's cutting from the same cloth a bit in Washington, of this man who is standing amongst these sculpted men who have been perished long eons ago. He is the one that is he's the one presently that is keeping this space alive. So who's the real hero, right?
Yeah, the janitors are just as much custodians of this space as the librarians who operate it. It's all, I think it's flattening this idea of what does it mean to preserve and maintain books and knowledge and culture isn't just the curatorial exercise of I decide which books go here and undertake the exercise of circulation, and what it does not get circulated. It is all
well, because you learn that too. And again, me just having the experience of being in like old European libraries or colleges or universities, et cetera, where you learn the sort of like intense, meticulous care that goes into preserving a book, right? Preserving pages, how there is some like it's a light sensitivity that has to be at a certain degree for this, right? And so it's a very delicate process. It literally is like rearing a baby. Like, how do you preserve these sort of ancient relics and pieces of information that have sort of been founding pillars of our textual existence, right? And so, I feel like I didn't pay as much attention to the janitors, but I'm so glad you brought it up, because like that absolutely, to me, that's what they stood for symbolically. Like, yeah.
We've been talking for like, I believe, over an hour now. I don't know if you have any maybe last thoughts, any summing up, or another room that you really wanted to talk about but didn't get to mention.
I think I would love to experience this again if I could. I think I would like to leave like time before, like I like, now that we are talking this out, like there is so much I can meditate on just from my seeing the project at first glance. But I wouldn't mind like experiencing it again, because that's what I always feel when I'm in an immersive experience. I always feel like I'm missing something. And I feel like that is part of it. You have to know that you are going to miss something, even if it is, you're in the library in Austria and you hear the door close, but you didn't actually see the monk go in it because you didn't turn around fast enough. Yeah. But it's like, you have to kind of like, it's okay that I didn't see that. Similarly, Mac and I unpacked with Grim Knight. If you followed Cinderella one night, I didn't see the evil witch in Sleeping Beauty's storyline, what they were doing at that time. Like there's, you kind of just have to go in with that. But so I'm always like, I'd love to see immersive theater more than once to just choose my own adventure differently. But yeah, I completely enjoyed my experience. And like we mentioned before, I think of someone who loves history, loves traveling. And the past couple of years, we haven't necessarily had the opportunity to do that. And maybe even now, financially, you still don't have the opportunity to do this. I think would be a great escape for you, a great, you're literally able to place yourself in areas all around the world, like Ryan said, from the courtesy of a building in Toronto. So for that sheer exploration, absolutely go. And yeah, we've unpacked all of the different artistic layers that come with this project too. So
yes.
Yeah. How about you, Ryan?
I think one last thing, there's no particular room or kind of grand thesis about the thing that I want to say. I kind of, one last thing I want to comment on is the prevalence or lack thereof of Lepage's authorship over this piece. Because adaptation is often a tug and pull of who has the authorial authority over the piece, and are we privileging the original, the author of the source, or is the adapter taking on this kind of grand authorship? I think what's really interesting is I would have never even thought to go to this if it didn't have Lepage's name on it. That as just like a Canadian theater enthusiast, I try to see every Lepage show because he is kind of part of our culture. I know a few years ago he came into a bit of a controversy that we don't need to unpack here. We talked about this at length in our episode on Coriolanus, the last Lepage piece that we actually addressed. Clearly, his career is doing fine. He hasn't been canceled as much as, the media kind of likes to jump on these controversies as they're unfolding. But I think it's interesting that as much as his name and his brand, the Ex Machina label of having, Lepage equals multimedia, technology, kind of grand spectacle, I feel like he's very subdued in this piece. Manguel is narrating the pieces himself. They are like verbatim extracts from his book. Mm-hmm. And, he's walking us through his autobiographical relationship to these different libraries, the history of books and reading. And I think maybe this is sort of ironic or interesting or possibly even calculated, but the way that Lepage has, on one hand, been framed as the grand creative mind behind this piece, he also effaces himself in it. That he, it's not like when you go see something like, Needles and Opium or 887, where you're just like seeing him on stage as himself or as versions of himself in different characters. The reason why I think this show could go on indefinitely beyond June 26th is because, as long as they have the staff to run it, you don't need to actually have Lepage there in the space to encounter it. And of course, you don't need Manguel either, because he pre-recorded this audiobook a long time ago. And you really just need the staff, and the VR headsets kind of are the performers themselves. So I think, this is like a nice stepping back behind the curtain for Lepage that I feel like I haven't seen in most of his work. Or Coriolanus could be like an interesting example, which still, while he wasn't on stage in that, still was very much branded with his star power the way this is too. But I think I like this as a next step in his career, especially coming out of the other side of controversy. And I am curious to see where this piece goes, how it kind of gets contextualized into his body of work and what he has next for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I am grateful. Sorry. Last thing, and I'm grateful that his name was attached to it, because I don't think I would have seen this otherwise, and I really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, what were you going to say?
Just his last name, Lepage. Like, he really was only a page in this experience. Yeah,
I didn't even think of that. That's fun.
That's me and my names and unpacking the names. Yeah.
Okay,
that's a great selection.
So I think we might bid adieu here. Thank you for those who've stuck with us till the very end. Thank you for following us along our journey. If you had a different experience, we'd love for you to get in the comments and tell us all about it. That's the lovely thing about immersive theater, or really any theater, is that we're always going to have our own subjective perceptions, and we'd love to know how things differ, what you thought differently. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe. We will have the link to the production in the description, so you can get tickets, and we encourage you to see it if you're interested. If you've made it this far, I hope you're interested. And yes, if you're listening to this as a podcast, like, share, subscribe, whatever people do with podcasts. And follow Cup of Hemlock on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, @COH Theater on all platforms. How about you, Jill? Mm-hmm. Plug your own socials and upcoming projects.
Sure. So yes, you can follow my artist Instagram account at Jillian.Robinson96. And I'm just going to let the cat out of the bag of some projects I have coming down the line. I will be a part of a new song cycle piece that is going up at the Calgary Fringe Festival this summer. So keep your eyes peeled for promo materials coming up on that. And I also have the privilege and honor with working with my dear friend and friend of the Cup, Autumn Smith, again this summer. I'll be performing as Olivia in 12th Night, an adaptation by Autumn herself, obviously based on the Shakespeare classic. That's going to be happening at the Gravenhurst Wharf. So if you are traveling this summer to Calgary or Muskokas, you might get to see yours truly acting alongside some super fabulous people. So I'm excited for that. Keep your eyes peeled. More information on my Instagram page.
Lovely. No need to follow me. Just follow Cup of Hemlock, or follow Jill, because Jill's great. And yes. Shall we close this chapter of these many books in the 10 libraries?
We shall. And cheers. Cheers our bell and U of T cups. Thanks so much, folks.
Yeah. Thanks for watching.